The year is 1954. An English author and scholar named J.R.R. Tolkien has published the first of his three-part fantasy epic entitled The Lord of the Rings, a sequel to his children's book The Hobbit, published in 1937. The story of how a hobbit named Frodo Baggins sets off on a quest throughout Middle-earth to destroy the evil One Ring before it can bring back the dark evil Lord Sauron. Almost 50 years later, the New Zealand filmmaker Peter Jackson adapts the books into a trilogy. The rest, as they say, is history. Do I really need to describe the impact of The Lord of the Rings? Not really. You know them, you love them. They're some of the greatest fantasy films ever made, one of the most solid film trilogies ever constructed, an absolute epic in every sense of the word. Over 20 years later, this Oscar-winning trilogy never fails to amaze me with just how solidly it's made, how beautiful it looks, how amazing the visual effects are, just how everything falls perfectly into place. This is the kind of film franchise that just can't be repeated. I adore it. If you're wondering which is my favorite, well, I go back and forth on Fellowship of the Ring or Return of the King, but for now, let's just say Fellowship is my favorite. But yeah, The Lord of the Rings is just a masterclass in filmmaking altogether. The definition of films that are lightning in a bottle. And yet, somehow, Warner Brothers has still tried to catch that lightning once again with unimpressive results. Almost 10 years after Lord of the Rings, Jackson was tasked to bring The Hobbit to life, which didn't exactly work out at all. And now we're going back to Middle-earth with another new prequel that this time is told through animation. This new film is called The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, and this is one I wasn't exactly fully sure how to feel about. I mean, it didn't look terrible, and I was modestly interested when I first saw the trailer, but I just had no idea how I was supposed to feel about this at the end of the day. And I guess I had several reasons for why I just didn't know how to feel, especially with the amount of history there is regarding Tolkien, Middle-earth, and film, The Lord of the Rings, and animation, as well as the film rights and who was making it. So I guess we should start off by talking about how Middle-earth came to be in the world of film. Much like how it took Tolkien years to write the story, it took Hollywood decades to adapt it to film, and plenty of people took stabs at it. And yes, believe it or not, Walt Disney Animation Studios was among them. Disney considered adapting The Hobbit to animation as far back as 1938, and even considered doing an animated take on the story for Fantasia, setting it to Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle, and Vance Gary even tried pitching it again in 1972 and even drew a sketch of Bilbo. But the studio chose not to make it. Even when Walt Disney himself pitched doing Lord of the Rings in the 50s, the animators thought the story was too much for them to do. Then afterwards, animator and Yellow Submarine producer Al Brodax considered an adaptation. Nothing came of that. Producer Forrest J. Ackerman also pitched the idea of an animated film. Nothing also came of that. Then Gene Deitch tried to turn it into a film, but the studios pulled out, and all that came was a 30-minute animated short loosely based on The Hobbit. But eventually we did get way for some animated Lord of the Rings productions in the 70s. We got 2 Rankin Bass specials based on The Hobbit and Return of the King, neither of which are any good, though it did lead to a hilarious parody in Smiling Friends. And then in 1978, the first attempt to bring The Lord of the Rings finally hit the big screens from filmmaker Ralph Bakshi, the adult animation filmmaker behind Fritz the Cat, Heavy Traffic, and Wizards, just to name a few. The film, which would have been the first of a 2-part duology, took Fellowship and Two Towers and combined them together to create a grand-scale epic that mainly resulted in being a mixed bag. I finally did see this film not too long ago, and while I certainly didn't hate it, it wasn't that great either. It does have some great highs, though, including a great take on Frodo, John Hurt as Aragorn, and some excellently portrayed dialogue scenes, but the other characters failed to leave a mark, except for Sam, who was annoying as all get out. The rotoscoped action was pretty bad, and the Two Towers portion of the film doesn't work at all. You can't take a book like that and try to rush it with 40 minutes left to go. I certainly don't think this is a good film, but I wouldn't call it a disaster either compared to something like David Lynch's disastrous take on Dune. I still find it fascinating to watch just to see how it set the stage for the Jackson films. It's a mixed bag overall, but certainly a fascinating film to watch. But because of management shakeups at United Artists, the second part was never made. And so, for 20 years, the books passed out of knowledge. Until, yeah, you know this part. And so that brings us back to The War of the Rohirrim, the first animated film set in Middle-earth since 1978. And as I said before, I did have odd feelings about this going in, and there were a few reasons why. For one, I haven't been all that impressed by other attempts to revisit Tolkien's grand world since Return of the King. For two, this film had a very short production time and was simply made just so Warner Brothers could keep the film rights to Lord of the Rings. And as for the last reason, despite it being marketed as being from legendary anime director Kenji Kamiyami, I haven't exactly been fully impressed by his work. He wrote Blood the Last Vampire in 2001, and I thought that was just simply okay. And he also wrote and directed Napping Princess in 2017, and I thought that film was incredibly stupid. I know he's also done a lot of Ghost in the Shell stuff as well, but I have yet to see it, so I can't comment my thoughts on those. But yeah, I was honestly not sure about how this new film could have turned out, as it looked to go either way. It could be either a noble prequel that beautifully expanded Peter Jackson's epic trilogy, or just another film by Warner Brothers trying to recapture that magic that just can't be brought back again. And now that I've seen it, I can certainly say that this film certainly falls into the latter category. This did nothing for me. I've seen a handful of bad films this year, and I wouldn't call The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim one of them, but I certainly wouldn't call it a good film either. It's a really unremarkable and generic film that doesn't add anything to the legacy of Lord of the Rings, nor stand alone as a good fantasy film. All it did was just waste my time and left me with a film that I don't think I'm going to remember in a few years. This film is a big bag of nothing. In the land of Middle-earth, many years before Bilbo Baggins found the One Ring, the kingdom of Rohan comes into conflict with the Dunlendings when their leader, Freka, comes into the palace of King Helm Hammerhand, played by Brian Cox, asking to unite their kingdoms by marrying Helm's daughter, Era, played by Gaia Wise, with Freka's son and Era's childhood friend, Wolf, played by Luke Pasqualino. Helm refuses the offer and challenges Freka to a fistfight and ends up killing him in battle. Years pass, and Hera, worried about Wolf, soon finds out his fate when she learns that he is planning a war against her kingdom and her father in an act of vengeance. And so, Hera must figure out how to stop the war and save her people against the enemy led by the man she once considered a friend. So, yeah, based on that premise, you're probably thinking, oh, yeah, this story. I've heard it before. It sounds unremarkable. And yeah, that's basically the gist of it. What I've told you is the basic meat of this film, and it's just not that captivating. This is a really generic story, and it doesn't have a whole lot of surprise in store whatsoever. It mostly goes by the book, and I could tell exactly where each scene was going, and it gave me nothing really big to chew on. As soon as Era meets up with Wolf again, you know how it's going to turn out, and basically it leaves you waiting for the big climax at the end, which isn't even all that exciting. It also doesn't help that the dialogue the characters say is stuff I've heard time and time again.
If I best you in combat, you let my people go.
I accept your challenge!
Really? This I accept your challenge nonsense? I've heard all of this before. This is some boring fantasy epic dialogue. It's not nearly as memorable as anything said in the trilogy. And that's honestly one of the film's major problems. It doesn't really work as a standalone film, and it really fails as an addition to the Lord of the Rings trilogy. This story doesn't add anything to the grand narrative that would have intrigued me. It's basically the story of how Helm's Deep got its name, and I just don't think that's interesting. Like, maybe it might be for some diehard Middle-earth fans, but I'm only a casual fan. So this just doesn't do a whole lot for me except throw in some occasional fan service that didn't excite me all that much. All it did was just make me roll my eyes.
What does Mordor want with rings?
Yeah, get it, Mordor, ring. I'm sure you can connect the dots. Look, I've said before that I don't mind a film having a familiar story as long as it's well told and does something interesting, but that's just the thing. This film's story is not interesting. It's been done before, and it's been done better. It's not that the film doesn't have its moments. There is a cool scene where Era tricks an Oliphant into a forest, but that's all they are. Moments. And if you're making a film set in a series as epic as Lord of the Rings, you have to make a story that can be captivating even if it's smaller. You can't just run on small moments alone. And you also need to have characters that are ones you can truly connect with. And that's ultimately the film's Achilles heel. One of the biggest strengths of Lord of the Rings are the characters. You really feel emotionally attached to every single one of them as they go on this epic journey to destroy the One Ring, and you identify with all of them. But these characters do not leave any impression on me at all. They are some of the most basic and flat characters I've seen in an animated film all year. Almost all of them have nothing to offer that you can't get in a better movie. There's only two characters that I genuinely liked. One was the character of Alwyn, who's Hera's handmaiden, and I thought she was a really cool character and incredibly strong. I also thought Elm Hammerhand was somewhat captivating at times, especially in the second half of the film, and Brian Cox was pretty good at him. The others... Most of the supporting players are just forgettable, though my major problems lie with the hero and villain, because they should have been a lot better. Let's talk about Era first. She's not a very captivating protagonist. I like the idea of a strong female hero set in Middle-earth, but the character's traits basically boils down to strong, independent princess. She doesn't stand out at all or do anything all that interesting, and even during some combat scenes, it seems like things around her allowed her the upper hand more often than not. It's a character that I wanted to see do more, but I'm not given a whole lot about her. All I'm left with is just the basics, and it's just not enough. It's really disappointing. Gaia Wise stated in interviews that when it comes to this character, she based her off of numerous Ghibli heroines, mainly Nausicaa, but she didn't really remind me of Nausicaa, or any Ghibli heroine for that matter. Nausicaa was a much stronger character than Era, mostly because she actually has a personality, and I really got to see her grow throughout her journey, and when situations were dire, she took drastic measures and stood up quickly. I didn't feel like at all with this character. She's just really flat. I wouldn't call her the worst animated female protagonist I've seen this year, considering Princess Elian was way worse than her, but I've also seen much better. At the very least, I can say she's better than Wolf, 'cause... wow, this is a wretched villain. Wolf has got to be one of the most one-dimensional and flat villains I've seen in a long time. This character has nothing under the surface and just boils down to being an angry guy wanting revenge. That's it. I did not find this guy the slightest bit intimidating, his major end goals made no sense, and his actions were so stupid that I could see his downfall coming a mile away. I get what the filmmakers were trying to do with him, as story writer and producer Philippa Boyne stated they made him a simple man to make him more threatening than a dark lord or evil wizard, and I like the idea in theory, but I thought this character was a complete failure. He doesn't come across as a ruthless, threatening warrior with sinister plans, but more of a stupid guy with anger issues that feels like someone who could be easily taken out and just needs to be put in a timeout chair. This is everything a villain should not be. And the other problems with these two characters is that the film clearly wants to give them tension as they were childhood friends, but I didn't feel that pain or tension. Mainly because the brief flashback we did see of them as kids just shows them sword fighting, but it doesn't seem like they're bonding or feeling happiness together. Hera keeps talking about how Wolf would never do such a thing.
The boy I knew would never wish for war.
But based on what I saw, I didn't get that impression. I never got the sense that these two were ever friends. And again, it just highlights the film's problem. I don't feel anything for these characters. Like, there's these dramatic moments where I'm supposed to feel something, especially regarding moments with Era's brothers, but it just left me cold. I don't know what I was supposed to take away from this. I guess the other compliment I can say is that the animation is decent. It's nothing exceptional, especially compared to other anime films I've seen this year, but it gets the job done. I never thought this film looked ugly, but it isn't anything fully captivating. Honestly, I think that's all I can say about this film. There's just not much to grab onto in The Lord of the Rings: The War of the Rohirrim. Despite some decent visuals and a few interesting characters, the film doesn't stand out at all, mainly thanks to its generic and unsurprising story that adds nothing to the legacy of Lord of the Rings, as well as its dull hero and wretched villain. If you're a diehard Lord of the Rings fan, maybe you might get something out of this, but for casual fans and newcomers, you're not missing much skipping it. This does feel like a film that was quickly rushed into development to keep the rights to the franchise and nothing else. For an anime set in the world of Middle-earth, this should have been a lot more captivating. And that's as far as I've got. I'm giving The Lord of the Rings: The War of the Rohirrim a 5. It's a film that just left me with nothing. If I have to be brutally honest, I'd rather rewatch the Ralph Bakshi film over this. At least that film gave me something interesting. This just didn't. It may not be a wretched war that was fought in Middle-earth, but sadly, this is a war that's most likely to be forgotten.
What does Mordor want with rings?